Welcome to Tech Right Now, the weekly podcast of the American Conservative. I'm Andrew Day, here with my colleagues Sumantra Maitra and Joseph Addington. We're going to talk about Ukraine today, and specifically President Donald Trump's apparent shift on Ukraine and his statement that NATO countries should shoot down Russian aircraft that violate their airspace. Then we'll talk about the shooting yesterday at an ICE field office in Dallas. We are recording on Thursday, a little after 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And lastly, we'll talk about the situation in Argentina. Joseph, our Latin America specialist, is going to update us on that. And basically, that has to do with America bailing out the Argentinian or Argentine economy. But first, Sumatra, Trump published a Truth Social post on Tuesday, I believe it was. It was the same day that he gave a speech to the UN General Assembly. Also, perhaps not coincidentally, the day that he met with President Zelensky. And a little after meeting with Zelensky, he posted on Truth Social something that made people think he was in a very pro Ukrainian mood. I would say that the meaning of the post is not completely apparent and that some interpretation is therefore required. I'm not going to read all of it, it's quite long, but Trump said that Ukraine, with the support of Europe and NATO, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. That's a quote. He called Russia a paper tiger. He said that it's having serious economic and military difficulties. And he said that Ukraine might be able not only to take back all of its territory, but possibly even to go further, meaning to take some Russian territory. That was the implication. And he said in the post that the U.S. will continue to supply weapons to NATO for NATO to do what they want with them, implying they can keep giving them to Ukraine to sustain the war effort. So previously, Trump had been saying that Ukraine would need to give up some territory as part of a peace deal. I had applauded him for saying so because that seems obvious and realistic to admit. So this does seem like a fairly substantial rhetorical shift at the very least. Although whether it augurs a major shift in policy, I'm not sure. So Mantra, what do you make of all of this?
Yeah, I broadly agree. When I first read that statement, I was just back from Europe. It was late at night, and obviously, it sounded extremely different from what we have been hearing from this administration, to the point where the statement itself contradicts the assessment of the administration for the last 2 years, for the campaign, and then the administration for the last 2 years. Essentially, anyone who was surrounding Trump or the intelligence agencies that Trump, including Tulsi Gabbard and his own VP, and other luminaries of the administration, they have constantly maintained, and including Trump, as you mentioned, they have maintained that it is not just difficult, almost impossible for Ukraine to take back all the territories that it has lost. That there needs to be some sort of a negotiation where Ukraine would have to agree to giving up some of the territories in lieu of neutrality or a ceasing of hostility between Russia and Ukraine. And finally, that Crimea is sort of like a red line for Russia. Like, I mean, it red line to the point where it can even reach to a nuclear escalation. That all seemingly sort of was swept away by this statement that Trump recently made on Truth Social. Uh, Nominal inspection of the statement would indicate that Trump at least believes, or his administration believes, we are in through his voice, that Ukraine can not just take back all the territories, but also including it also, I mean, taking back the territories can include taking back some of the parts of Russia as well. Now, initially, when I read that, I was a little shocked, obviously. But then I reread the statement, and obviously, I don't want to, jump the guns here, and I'm not here to justify the administration's, stance on Ukraine. But it is a little bit more ambiguous than what it's made out to be, and that if you read the European reaction to Trump's statement, it kind of shows that they are initially they were like, "Oh, fine, this is great." Like this, there's been a rhetorical shift, but then over time, when they kept on rereading the statement, they were also came to the same conclusion that, hang on a minute, this is it could be interpreted both ways. Like this, Trump is laying a ground for like walking away from the entire scenario. I'll point out the three things in that statement which struck me. One, Ukrainians are fighting really hard, and they can take back the territories and maybe take up chunks of Russia. Well, taking up chunks of Russia doesn't really mean much. The Ukrainians already did take a little bit of Kursk in a counter, invasion, but they couldn't maintain that. But there was essentially, from everyone, like from what we gathered and from what we have heard from other people, say that that was used as a negotiation tactic. It wasn't very successful because the Russians essentially ignored and got a bunch of North Koreans to fight there. But basically, that was used as a negotiation tactic from the Ukrainian side. So it is not something which is new. The second thing that he mentioned is, we are going to have to sell weapons to NATO. That itself is a change from the Biden administration, where we were essentially doing kind of like a version of lend lease in a way. But this time it is like, no, we are. I mean, even subsequently, Scott Bessent and others who gave statements in the news kind of like reinforced that idea that, look, we are sending weapons to NATO and European Union for them to do whatever they want to do, but basically we are selling it to them rather than like taking an active part in the conflict. At the end of the day, it is a European conflict. The most interesting part of that statement was Trump ended by saying, "Good luck to all." That is not the way when I mean, if you are an active party to a hostility, an active belligerent, then you wouldn't just phrase it in a way where you're essentially kind of like a referee saying like, "Good luck, fight it out on yourself." So I don't know. No one actually knows where the administration stands. I think the speech the day after by Vice President J.D. Vance was extremely important when he said that like Trump was sort of pissed with the Russians. He thinks that the Russians are taking him for a ride, and I can kind of see that. Like even in our personal experiences talking to the Russians on the Russian side, you get to see that they they make a big deal of a negotiation, but they haven't really budged when it comes to they're kind of like coldly confident about they are going to prevail on the battlefield. I tend to think that that is a little bit hubristic and a little bit more overconfident than it's supposed to be. I mean, after all, at the end of the day, it is almost like 3.5 years now, and they haven't really done much in getting more than like 20% of Ukraine. But on the other hand, the nature of a conflict which is attritional means that the collapse is mostly sudden. So we don't really know where the Russians stand. We certainly know that the Russians are extremely confident about their battlefield prowess and the fact that they're confident that they're going to survive this ordeal. Um, from what Vance said, that pissed Trump off. I think there was a genuine interest from the Trump administration to reach out to the Russians, and they kind of feel jilted about it that the Russians didn't really take, Trump's overture, and they didn't really shake the hand. But that being said, I also don't think that Trump essentially wants to escalate in Ukraine. The NATO question is a little different. I can imagine, Trump or pretty much like anyone in the NATO. I mean, I'm actually surprised that they didn't shoot down any Russian drones.
I
Uh,
want to come back to that.
yeah,
I'm going to ask you a question about that. I'm going to go to Joseph, but first I want to say it might be important to know if you read the fine print on this NATO weapons scheme, it actually involves a little bit of U.S. foreign military financing, not to the same extent as when Israel supposedly buys our weapons, but we first give them the money that they use to buy our weapons. It's not, totally financing it, but the financing is being subsidized by the U.S. taxpayer. And when I say the fine print, I mean like 12 paragraphs down in the New York Times reporting on the subject. Another thing that's interesting to know, in addition to this Vance speech, which actually I haven't watched yet, but Marco Rubio gave the impression that U.S. policy hasn't changed. Even after Trump released this Truth Social post, Rubio said what the administration has been saying, that this war is going to end in a negotiation, right? And not, and the two sides are not going to be fully happy with what happens. With the outcome of that. That's different from Trump's post, which suggested he thinks that Ukraine is going to like defeat Russia eventually, which I'm sorry is not going to happen. So I hope that's not the actual basis of our approach to Ukraine going forward. And I suspect that it's not. I suspect this is a kind of Trump putting pressure on Putin and kind of announcing his, withdrawing from peace talks. Joseph, what did you make about this Truth Social post that everyone's talking about?
Yeah, I think it's only reasonable to expect a reverse in the Trump administration, well, especially in Trump's personal approach towards the conflict, because he did really set a lot of stock in reaching out to Russia and establishing negotiations to end the war. And in every case, he's largely been able to convince the Ukrainians to come along, which is not that surprising because the US is a major funder of Ukraine's efforts in the war. And so we have a lot of leverage on them. So at that point, it has been up to Putin and the Russians. And although they've showed up to some summits, they have made really no movement whatsoever in actually coming to any kind of accommodation or expressing serious interest in a negotiated peace. So I think it's only reasonable to expect that Trump is going to be disappointed and probably quite unhappy with the Russian side. And so what the reaction to that will be beyond mere words is something that we're going to have to find out. But I suspect that there will be a significant shift in that the Trump administration is going to simply be less interested in cooperating with the Russians and less conciliatory towards Russian interests because the United States has reached out and attempted to be conciliatory ourselves and have received nothing in return. So,
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah, I want to move on to this thing that you were starting to bring up, Sumantra. These Russian incursions into the airspace of NATO countries, European countries. So first we had, I think something close to like 2 dozen drones. They wound up being unarmed decoy drones, basically that flew into Polish territory. A few of them were shot down. It's very expensive to shoot these things down, and these drones are very inexpensive. So that's like an asymmetry that doesn't work in NATO's favor. Then another drone went into Romanian airspace, and then most recently, um, a drone flew into Estonian airspace. It turns out that it was actually in like the Gulf of Finland, but technically in the airspace of some island that's like owned by Estonia or something, right? So it wasn't quite as invasive as people had originally feared, but nevertheless, you know, it does seem like Russia is up to something. So I'm glad I have you here on today's podcast, Sumantra, because you're something of an expert on Russian aggression, what to make of it, like what's going on, what do these signals mean? Some people have framed these incursions as a kind of probing, a testing of our air defenses, of NATO's air defenses. You've written that it's more of a signal. So can you kind of talk about how you're interpreting this and how NATO should respond?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm right, obviously, but I do think it's not probing. Like, I mean, there is nothing really to probe when it comes to NATO air defenses or NATO signaling that the Russians don't really already know. It's one thing to do something which is in a completely new, if you're planning to go to a war with Ukraine and you're probing the battlefield before you invade, that is a different thing. But the Russians already know what the reaction would be if they actually invade any NATO country. The reaction would be they are going to be in a war with NATO. It's not a neutral question. The second thing is during the Cold War, there were instances where we used to, fly planes straight towards the Russian border and then turn it, right before it. I mean, Nixon did it, for example, with the Russians. The Russians did it in Alaska. But again, the war fighting in those days was a lot different and more rudimentary in some ways than how we think of going to war these days. I personally think that this is more of a signaling, in a sense, how the Russians, before the last bout of negotiations with the Russians, they when there was this huge talk of starting a no-fly zone over western Ukraine, what the Russians did was they dump a whole bunch of their new hypersonic ballistic missiles on named Oreshnik on the town of Dnipro. It was interesting to see because usually these missiles have like MIRVs, like multiple independent relaunch vehicles. So essentially they go up and then they split. The warhead splits into 12 or like 6 or 12 independent warheads, and then it's just like massive, an incredible number, amount of speed,
Nuclear capable.
nuclear
Mhm.
capable. They fly down, and the kinetic blast is seen when they are entering the atmosphere. So they did that, but without any warheads. So essentially, the social media videos that you can find are, this incredibly fast warheads dropping and like tearing through time and space and falling at a very concentrated surface. but without any secondary blast happening, which means like they're completely duds. Now, why would the Russians do that? And then immediately within like a couple of days, Putin went and gave a speech saying, like, by the way, of all the people talking about having a no-fly zone, remember that we have these missiles and you can't really stop us. If you genuinely want to go to a war with Russia, we have the capability and it's functional. So it kind of like put a stop to those, conversations. I think this is something similar. At this point of time, they have repeatedly mentioned to us, like I was mentioning before, that they can prevail in a war of attrition because they have got cheap offense. And I've written about how drones and cheap offense would be kind of like a shift in the way offense defense balance is maintained. I think they are also trying to show that, look, we have these things, we can send it, across the border. You're gonna shoot them down, but you're gonna spend like millions of dollars in shooting down a $10,000 drone. It's not worth it. We're not interested in doing it. It could be a mix of both probe and signal. I do think, though, that NATO has missed an opportunity of making a stand when there were some of the Russian drones initially when they entered. I mean, a case could have been made that NATO probably should have made a gesture where they were, aggressively shooting down Russian drones the moment it crossed a NATO airspace, just to show that, look, there is a difference between Ukraine and NATO. One is a treaty bound ally, and the others are not part of that treaty. And that is something which this administration have constantly maintained, even through back channels. Like, look, Ukraine is a different case. Part of the reason is because it's not a failure of deterrence in NATO. It's basically that Ukraine is not part of NATO anyway. I think that opportunity was kind of missed. I don't think that one should shoot down Russian planes on top of Ukrainian airspace. I think that's a ridiculous statement, and we are going to end up in a. And part of the reason why we had a deconfliction zone in Syria is because we wanted to avoid shooting down Russian planes over Syria. That's why we had all these back channel talks. The similar situation is there in Ukraine. But that
Do
being
you make
said,
a difference, but do you make a distinction, though, between these fighter jets and drones? Would you ever shoot down? I won't say ever, because obviously in some cases you would, but the fighter jets have only entered airspace in the case of Estonia when they were over that little island, right? That was a fighter jet, not a drone. And then also recently, I think today or yesterday, the reports came out today that U.S. jets were scrambled to intercept Russian jets that were near Alaska, not in our airspace, but in our like air identification zone or whatever it's called. Would
but
you would
we
you
have
shoot
been
them
doing
down?
that for a long time. I mean,
Yeah,
when I
that's
mean,
not
yeah,
unusual.
it's not unusual. If you remember, in 2007, when George W. Bush unilaterally came out of the ABM treaty in Europe and said that we are going to place our missiles back in east of Danube. The Russians maintained that, by the way, we don't really like it because that's not part of the plan. You guys promised us not to do that. And then Bush started flying massive bomber jets on top of the Baltics. Like the first Baltic patrolling of NATO forces started around, I think it was in 2007 or 8. And then the
Mm.
Russians did the exact same thing around Alaska. So this is not, I mean, people, I understand that, it's like muscle memory kind of like goes away, but none of these things are new. As for the shooting down of fighter jets and drones, I think I would personally, if I was given a choice, I'd probably make a distinction. I think loss of human casualty is a difficult thing to swallow. So I would probably like escort the drones, escort the fighter jets, and like kind of intercept and like put it back. Like standard operating procedure would apply there. But I think for drones, which are unmanned, I mean, I don't see a point why we don't shoot down drones other than the
Except
fact
for
that
the cost.
except for
Yeah.
the cost. But again, like there are ways of cheaply frying drones. Like the
That's what I'm
Ukrainians are
thinking,
using
like,
like anti-aircraft guns from the 1940s to do that.
right. Like it seems like a Glock could accomplish it
Yeah.
with these drones that we have today, which are much smaller. I mean, I don't know what these specific decoy drones were like. I know that they were kind of imitating, or they were supposed to look like these Iranian drones. Um, but yeah,
Yeah,
and
they also didn't have any warheads. Like the ones which were
yeah.
shot down, they were duds.
Yeah, they were unarmed. Um, and there's another data point here, which is that Denmark had drones go into its country, and actually they shut down the Copenhagen airport, although it hasn't yet been confirmed that those were Russian. Although I kind of assume they were. It does seem like Russia is doing something systematically here, but we'll keep on top of this and continue to talk about it. Right now, I want to talk about this shooting yesterday at the ice It's not a detention facility. It might be sometimes called that, but it's a field office. So it's where detainees are processed and briefly held as they're kind of going through the deportation process. So this seems to be, in my perception, a kind of copycat. This was a sniper from an elevated position. People are now trying to figure out what his ideology is. Shortly after the news broke, Kash Patel released this picture of these bullets, unspent bullets, one of which said anti-ice. So, it should be obvious, I guess, that he's firing at a ICE detention facility literally on the building as well as on a van that was outside of it, as I understand. So it should be obvious that he's like an anti-ICE guy, but weirdly, he didn't strike any ICE officers. He struck detainees and he like illegal aliens who were being held and arrested or who had been arrested. One of them has been killed, two are wounded. Last I checked, one of the wounded is gravely injured, and it sounds like maybe he could also die. He's of Mexican descent, I believe. Um, so that was one of the weirder kind of factors here. Some people on the left were trying to make it seem like this was a right wing attack on immigrants or something, like white guy shoots illegal immigrants, But now it's becoming clear that this indeed was a guy motivated by anti-ICE sentiments, although his personality is kind of bizarre, and maybe we can get into that. Joseph, what do you want to add to this? You've probably been following it a little closer than I have. How are you thinking of this in terms of the general context of like conservatives' concerns about left-wing political violence, and what do you want to say about the situation?
Sure. I think this is an obvious case of exactly what I was worried about with the Charlie Kirk assassination, which is that when you begin to normalize political violence and it begins to prove effective at doing things that people who are inclined to political violence care about, like take out important conservative influencers, uh, or disrupt ICE operations, then you get increased levels of violence, especially if there are no serious consequences for it. And whatever one can say about the Trump administration, uh, there have been really no consequences whatsoever for the Charlie Kirk assassination for the left. The most you saw is a little bit of threatening to use the FCC to regulate, which, the FCC has the authority to regulate uh, false speech on broadcast pertaining to crimes. So that is within the legal authority of the FCC. You can question whether that's wise, but it has absolutely been used by the left against conservatives in the past. So, um, but in any case, there have been no consequences whatsoever. The FCC did not, in fact, go after Jimmy Kimmel. Uh, he's back on the air after 3 or 4 days. There's been no real crackdown on Antifa, despite the proclamation from President Trump. Nobody's gone to jail, even when they are lining up outside and surrounding the federal courthouse in Portland. Um,
Did
and
that happen since the new designation of Antifa as a terrorist
yes,
organization? Huh.
and there's been no effort to really target and disrupt uh, financially the organizations which fund and justify and assist these people in organizing and so forth. So there's
But
been
is
no
that
real
really
consequence.
connected to this situation? Because this guy seems like just another individual weirdo, right? Like he seems like a person, like a nihilist lone wolf freak. Like how do you stop that?
Well, again, part of it is it has to be seen as counterproductive. If
But he
there
like he
happens
killed himself afterwards. Like how do you affect his incentive structure? He blew his head up after right after he did this. It seems like a non-rational actor.
Yes, but even these people have things that they want to do, right? They are not they're not purely rational, but they're not completely crazy. He had a political objective. He went after ICE, right? And as an aside, uh, this should be your base case when you're looking at political assassinations. First of all, is generally people who do political assassinations and commit political violence are often not mentally well in general, but they generally do have political objectives, which are usually legible, even if they don't necessarily line up neatly with like normal political opinion. Um, but in any case, so yes, people can be dissuaded. It may be difficult to do so. But in general, if it is politically, because sure, these people are lone wolves, but they live in an environment and in a culture which which legitimizes and provokes their political opinions. So if you delegitimize or make political violence extremely costly, for anyone in for the broader political movement to engage in, it will make it culturally much less accepted and therefore less validated for people. Now, here's I suppose what I want to get to is there has been a lot of talk about the people who were interviewing journalists have interviewed his friends, and they said, "Oh, he was a deeply ironic and sarcastic and edgy
You read
guy."
the Ken Klippenstein thing, huh?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Irony and irony and sarcasm are generally not they what they generally do is they generally mask deeper and more frustrated feelings. Like somebody who's being ironic and being edgy is not, you know, is not necessarily harmless even if they are being ironic, and it's not necessarily that they are actually expressing a disinclination to do the kinds of things that they talk about. Irony is generally a defense mechanism, and it's often a sort of learned helplessness that people put up in place. But a lot of people who are ironic would often act on their supposedly ironic or sarcastic comments if the situation was conducive to it. And so, obviously, this kind of person, when he was making his ironic and edgy jokes, was in fact serious enough to actually act on them and go out and shoot at people and then kill himself. Uh, and so at that point, that's not irony anymore. So there are a lot of people that are ironic and sarcastic until they are not. So the attempt to deduce that because this person had an ironic source of humor or was sarcastic is not a defense against the fact that, oh, he couldn't actually have meant that, and he couldn't actually have disliked ice. He wasn't a nihilist. He didn't just go out and shoot random people. He made a targeted political attack with a political motive.
Yeah, I thought this Klippenstein article was weaker than the one that he wrote about the Tyler Robinson, the guy who killed Kirk, because in that article he was just trying to show that these Discord messages that he had obtained like all of his Discord chats, and they showed that actually his like Discord community didn't know that this was going to happen, and they weren't like planning this with him, and that's useful information from a journalistic perspective. Whereas this one, I thought Klippenstein, he clearly wanted to say that this guy wasn't a lefty, and the way that he was interpreting the evidence, I think, was a little too editorializing or something. I mean, the guy had he had a gamer account that had the word like impeachment, like pro impeachment or something in it, like clearly referring to like impeachment of Trump. He had a communist avatar of some kind as his like account profile picture. He does seem like a kind of edge lord, ironic guy, but I didn't really see why any of the evidence presented showed that he wasn't a lefty. But Sumantra, do you want to add anything to this situation, this latest instance of political violence in America?
No, I kind of like agree with what you guys said anyway. I think from what we have seen so far, I think this guy's family was extremely radical. Part of the resistance liberal thing that we have been seeing since, I don't know, 2015 now. It's kind of funny that the entire mass media who are talking about how Tyler Robinson's family is Republican and therefore Robinson is a right wing. They have stopped talking about the family background now that like this guy's family is completely left wing. So that's sort of like, again, this is not, none of that assessment is new. It's not hypocrisy. It's like it's genuine, like, skullduggery in a way. But that being said, I do think there is a broader sociological dynamic, which is not being touched here. Every movement, whether it's right wing or left wing, uses that especially given our our age of social media, uses that idea of using irony to push for something, and then it kind of gives you a plausible deniability. Now the problem is, given that we live in a democracy, and most of significant as the great Osho once reminded us, it's most of the people are not very smart, to put it politely. The difference between the dynamic when it comes to like talking. So imagine talking like signaling in a bridge club, and showing your social status by taking a very controversial position is one thing, but then there will be people who are basically imbeciles who are going to take that to their to their logical conclusion, and that is a problem, which is currently the left is facing. Like they have festered this for 9 years. They've festered this idea of we're fighting the Nazis, we're fighting the thugs. Technically the Nazis were not defeated by, I mean, and then their policy suggestion is like, go and vote and debate. Like, Nazis were not defeated by debating. They were defeated because someone put a boot on the throat. uh,
Antifa often says that.
right,
That's their
right.
whole
And
thing.
Antifa, and to be fair, they're at least they're logically coherent. They are saying that, but
Hmm.
if you're saying that these guys are Nazis, we have to have a civil war.
Yeah.
That is the only way of fighting Nazis. And like that again, this is not a right wing or left wing thing. My Someone tweeted, I think this morning, that the Gramscians and the Leninists are essentially going to find themselves at crosshairs, because sooner or later the rhetoric, comes to play. And I feel the same thing for both left wing and right wing. Like, one, if you are saying that the other side are Nazis, then eventually some of your coalition would go and actually go to war with the Nazis. Same with the right wing. If you're keeping on saying that the other side are basically like communists, well, the Spanish Civil War happened because the communists were trying to like dig up nuns and shoot them in public. I personally don't believe that most of the people who say these things on social media actually believes that. Like, it's kind of like it's a sign of our times that this happens. But there is a risk of individual violence that would be precipitated from these kind of rhetoric, and I don't really have any answer. I mean, tomorrow it could be us from our side, and I feel that's not a place I'd want to be.
Yeah. No, that all sounds wise. I maybe I'll just kind of dabble in like the hottest of hot takes, and I'm not even sure I agree with it. But it might be interesting to put on the table. Leftism, it has gone through some mutations over the course of its history. It's not always been the same thing. Like, it originally comes from the seating arrangements during the French
Right.
Revolution at like the National Assembly, right?
Yes.
So originally being a left winger meant that you wanted to go all the way and like overthrowing the ancien regime, and you were really opposed to like aristocracy and monarchy and stuff.
You supported
Um,
beheading the king.
right. And then obviously in the Marxist era, it took on a more economics focus, like it was more materialist. I mean, Marxists have their interpretations of the French Revolution as itself being an outcome of material factors. But you know, leftism was associated with socialism and wanting to overthrow capitalism. And then, in sometime in my lifetime, it became more about like these kind of boutique cultural issues, like, and most recently the trans thing. And it seems to me that leftism, understood comprehensively, is not actually a set of ideas, but it's like an affect. It's like a disposition of. It's like a negative spirit. Like it's against things. It's against society. It wants to overthrow the existing order. And I do wonder if it's almost become its like inner nihilism or something, at least in the heads and in the hearts of certain individuals. Because this guy, if you read about him, this guy who shot this ICE officer in van, he just seems like a freak to me, like a freak show. Like, I don't doubt he's a leftist, but I'm not sure that he had real ideas. Like, I think he just had this animating antithetical spirit, to use a kind of Hegelian term. And that kind of freaks me out. Like, I'm more. I think that sounds scarier to me than like Antifa. Like the possibility of these. I think there's even a term for this that the FBI has started using. These like individual nihilistic terrorists or something like that. I don't want to brush that off. Like, I think that could be a thing we need to start worrying more about. And I don't necessarily see that as distinct from leftism. Um, but, as I said, that's a very hot take. I think we need to move on. I kind of wanted to bring something else up. Maybe we'll just briefly. Do you guys make anything of the fact that these shooters, like the guy who shot Trump in the head, the guy who tried to shoot him at a golf course or whatever, the Charlie Kirk assassin, now this new guy, do you make anything of the fact that these are all white guys? Like, it seems like a unifying factor. The media is obviously going to lean into that, right? It's, most homicide, generally black men are much more likely to commit a homicide than a white guy. But it seems like this political violence, these like snipers trying to take out conservatives are white guys. Why do you think that is?
I think it's I think that it is just of the fact that, relatively speaking, white people are much more likely to be motivated by abstract causes, political, moral, theological, and so forth, uh, than minorities, in general, black or otherwise. So
Yeah, Hispanics kind of famously, they tend to vote Democratic, but they famously kind of vote on based on economic interests. Like, who do you trust on the economy for Hispanics is like it really is determinative of how they're going to vote. So yeah, that makes sense to me.
I
So much. I
think
don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, I totally agree. I just want to add, like, essentially black political violence was materialistic, especially in the 60s and 70s. Same with the Puerto Rico, like it was independence motivated and all that kind of stuff. Hispanics
it was
were like
often mostly opportunistic.
opportunistic violence too. I think I totally agree that on an average, you see a lot of white guys being animated by abstract ideas, and they turn to they get radicalized in spheres. There's also a question of class. Majority of the people who have been, at least in the last few years, who have been in who are white and who have been committing these kind of atrocities are from an affluent class. The fact that they don't have to worry about their material issues gives them time enough to worry about political issues, which essentially turns them towards a little bit more. I mean, that I again, if
The first Trump shooter, the guy who got his ear, he was like working in a kitchen at a nursing home or something,
was
right? I
he
don't think, yeah.
I think that
Uh,
guy, yeah, he was. I don't know. I mean, when I see the Antifa, the Andy No, or I don't know how to pronounce his surname. Like
I
when
think
he
that's
puts
right.
out like the mug shots, someone tweeted like, I don't see any H1Bs there, and that was like really funny. But like it is true in a way. Like there are, it is almost 99%. Like when people talk of like importing more Scandinavians, and I'm thinking like, by the way, Scandinavians wherever they are extremely Antifa. So I don't know. I mean, look, I'm not here to generalize, but I think Joseph is right. I think it is a question of abstract ideology.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a coincidence that a bunch of Somalis moved to Minneapolis. Like that's where Scandinavian white people live.
That's right.
Hmm.
I do think that I do think that it's important to note that a lot of the people, both the political violence and just Antifa types generally, are downwardly mobile, affluent people.
That is a very interesting
That
point.
is, they come from a relatively wealthy background, but they are often significantly worse off than their parents, often because they choose to pursue ideological ends over sort of more bourgeois concerns. They go
Yeah.
into journalism, for example. That's the famous stereotype.
Yeah. No, that's true.
And
When I've known some left-wing radicals, and I think to a man, they came from upper middle class, fairly affluent environments, but they were on course for being much poorer than their parents because of their life choices.
this is
Mm.
especially true of women, and women, I think, make up the largest and most radical class of the Antifa type militants. However, they're much less likely to commit political violence, like
Well, that's just a
assassinations and
testosterone
things,
thing. Yeah.
than men are of the
Just for
same
test that's just a
ideological
hormonal
persuasion.
thing.
I don't know. I
Yeah.
mean, from Andy No's videos, like I mean, overwhelming amount of Antifa women are the ones who are like throwing bricks and like punching people on the. I mean,
In
there's that.
mobs, they will, but not these kind
Right,
of
but like
individual
an elderly
assassinations.
couple was walking, and these guys were like just following like a pack of hyenas, and just like
Yeah.
clubbed someone from behind. I'm like, that is just abject cowardice. It's just like you're
Yeah.
hitting an old person from behind. and that's your revolution? Like, what the hell?
Yeah, it's messed up. What happened to Andy No is unforgivable. Not just the Antifa attacks on him, but the way that his name was sullied, dragged through the mud.
Right,
People have left wingers hear Andy No and they just like fly into a rage, like they want to kill him.
right.
And then you ask them, what did he do? Like, why do you hate him so much? They don't have a good answer. It's ridiculous. But anyway, look, we don't have a lot of time because I have to take care of some annoying personal things, getting a new license plate and registration in Maryland. But I really quickly, Joseph, want to go to you because I'm a little confused by the news around Argentina because Trump and the Trump administration are America first. They look out for the interests of Americans. And Argentina is governed by Milei, who has brought about an economic miracle in Argentina by cutting red tape. And yet, it sounds like we're preparing to do a big bailout for Argentina and a political bailout, basically, for Malay. So, what the heck's going on? And are you critical of this? Because it seems like something that conservatives would not be happy about.
No, actually, I think it's a great step in the right direction. So first of all, cards on the table. I am a Malay booster, so
I know.
I think Malay is personally very crazy, but I think that he's absolutely headed in the right direction. And I've written positively about him in the past. So all cards on the table there. Um, so the first thing that people have to realize when we're talking about Malay is that like, by any objective measure, Malay is significantly better economically than any other option in Argentina. He turned the country around from what threatened to be an absolutely horrific deflationary spiral, 125% inflation in 1 month, December of 2024 when he was elected, now to, very low single-digit inflation numbers monthly, which is still high, but not anywhere near what it could have been. Um, and, Argentina is dramatically overburdened by all kinds of public sector pensions, by completely unproductive nationalized industries, by massive currency and import and export regulations intended to create sort of an autarkic state under the Peronist government that dominated Argentina for many years, and so forth. So, what Malay is doing is absolutely necessary to establish Argentina on any kind of firm footing. That said, because the government and the economy has been such a mess for so long, and Argentina's in so much debt, what Malay is relying on to fix Argentina's economy is foreign direct investment. The bet is by loosening Argentina's regulations, by making it so that companies before Malay, the rule was that if companies invested in Argentina, they had to keep any profits that they made in the country. They could never take them out. And so there was almost zero incentive for anybody to invest in Argentina ever because you could never take your profits out of the country. Um, and so what Malay is doing is rolling back all of these regulations and all of these currency controls and restrictions. And the bet is that, at the same time as a lot of people are going to economically feel the hurt whenever you get these kinds of austerity measures, because yes, you are firing people from completely unproductive public sector institutions, these nationalized corporations that run at a continuous loss. If you're going to make these economically profitable, you have to fire people, and you're going to be cutting pensions and subsidies because the state is underwater. Traditionally, the way that this was done in Peronist governments is you simply pay those unfunded mandates by printing money, and the result is massive inflation.
But why should America care? Why should we do anything to help Argentina out?
Sure. So the question is, what is the question is what are American interests? And the first thing is, I think that it is actually quite important that America maintains good relations generally with Latin America and has a Latin American system in which friendly governments are able to in which friendly governments benefit from cooperating with the United States. So there are a lot of ways that America can orient its Latin American policy. It can be interventionist and pressure countries that are hostile with threats. This is the thing that the Trump administration has done with Mexico. Mexico is run by a left-wing government. It's not naturally cooperative with the United States, and so the Trump administration says, do what we want, or we will punish you with tariffs and we'll crash your economy. That's one way of extracting cooperation. Another way is rewarding friendly countries that do what you want, which is what the administration is doing with Argentina. This is something that the United States has traditionally not done very much, but this is the way that China runs its Latin American influence policy. In fact, China currently has an outstanding $18 billion credit swap running with the Argentine government right now. And so part of the negotiations that are ongoing with the $20 billion credit swap that the Treasury is going to extend to Argentina will almost certainly be a closing of this outstanding Chinese currency swap that they have going. And this is one of the ways that the Trump administration and the United States, as we renew our focus on Latin America, can exert our influence there and create a cooperative hemispheric system as we try to do things like nearshore our manufacturing, open up important critical minerals and other kinds of critical
Lithium.
industries that we
Argentina
want.
has like the second largest reserves of lithium, right? I
Argentina
think
has
that's a big part
massive
of
lithium
this.
reserves. It has all kinds of mineral reserves. It's a,
Hmm.
it's also a huge agricultural exporter, which is less important for the United States because we already have a big agricultural industry. But Argentina has a lot of very important primary materials and inputs. Um, and so, but in general, Argentina can also serve as an example. If you go along with what we as the United States want you to do, we will help your government out when you're in trouble. And that's a powerful incentive. So, and again, this is the way that China does its diplomacy in Latin America. And so the United States, as we're again returning our focus to creating a hemispheric defense policy, putting a greater focus on Latin America as a region, this is something that we're going to need to do. And we can wield both ends. We can say, you know, do what we say or we'll punish you economically, but we can also offer the carrot, help us out, and we'll help you out as well. So I think that is actually a very good way. And especially if, as I suspect, we see a direct replacement of Chinese aid for American aid, that I think is a positive win. The United States is not in any danger of going bankrupt or anything uh, from these kinds of currency swaps and debt agreements. It's a relatively low cost for us, but if we do so periodically and in places where it can have a big impact, like in Argentina until the election, then I think that that's very wise. So, because fundamentally what happened is Milei suffered some electoral setbacks, and that made investors very nervous because Milei is the only thing that makes Argentina worth investing in. If Milei and his party go out, then there's no reason, then the Peronists will come back in, and you'll see the same problems in Argentina over again. So investors naturally do not want to invest in Argentina unless there's a relatively uh, good guarantee that Milei and his reforms will remain in place. So it's not a problem necessarily with Malay's economic reforms so much as those economic reforms won't matter if Malay gets kicked out and then they get undone.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I wanted to start out a little harshly toward Malay to kind of spur you along a little because I know you're a fan. But
I
that
mean,
makes
he's
sense.
made some political mistakes. He's made some bad moves.
Yeah,
So like
and
that is on him.
he's got some corruption scandals going on, but I think I broadly agree with you. But we need to go to our picks of the week. I'm actually going to pick a Sumantra Maitra piece called "Russian Drones Over Poland Aren't a Probe but a Signal." I'm picking this piece because I think this situation with these Russian drones and also now fighter jets in or near the airspace of NATO countries, I think it's something really worth watching, and that there's not a lot of people who have kind of a sober analysis of it. I guess I could also recommend coming out tomorrow is a piece on the subject by Anatol Levin of the Quincy Institute. I forget what the title of that is, but that's probably also going to be well worth reading. So that's my pick. Sumantra Maitra, Russian drones over Poland aren't a probe, but a signal. Sumantra, what's your pick of the week?
My pick is Jude Russo's article. It's time for the White House to get real. On trade, immigration, and war. I think it's a good assessment. He's pessimistic, and rightfully so. So am I. I think there has been a change in the way administration is functioning in the last 4 months, and Jude's proposition is to get its act together. So I strongly suggest everyone to read that.
Yeah, that's a nice read, which he wrote on a park bench in New York. by
Look
the
at
way.
that.
In case our listeners want to know how the sausage is made exactly over here at Tech. Joseph, what's your pick of the week?
Sure. I will take Spencer wrote a fantastic essay about Erica Kirk's speech at the Charlie Kirk Memorial. It's a wonderful piece, and so I will go ahead and recommend that. I really like what Spencer puts out, so I tend to recommend him a lot, but this one is absolutely worth your time.
Yeah,
The
and
Speech for the
it,
Ages by Spencer Neal.
it's a little frightening what happened to Spencer. He had a health scare of a severe kind. So he writes about it in that piece. But that brings us to the end of our episode. I want to thank our listeners for listening to the end. Remind you, you can watch these episodes on YouTube. And if you're doing that, if you're watching this on YouTube, please smash the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave a comment. Let us know how much you enjoyed the episode. And I want to thank you, Sumantra, and you, Joseph, for the illuminating discussion. See you next time.